This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today I wanted to talk about phonology. The title of this episode is Phonology Redux, because we've already had a phonology episode, but I feel like I didn't give enough time to talking about optimality theory and the issues that surround it. And I've had a couple questions via email concerning optimality theory, and so I thought it would be a good time to revisit it and talk about what the deal really with OT is, because I don't think I did that well enough in the phonology episode. So in that episode, OT was sort of covered as an aside to rule-based phonology. And that sort of made sense to me because rule-based phonology is the typical kind of way that phonology is approached in introductory linguistics courses. However, it is true that optimality theory really has taken over in the kind of phonology segment of linguistics literature. In that subfield, it's really taken over, and you don't see really anybody doing rule-based phonology in terms of peer-reviewed work. Certainly there are some people that, well, maybe there are some people that still do it, but in terms of what's being published, optimality theory really rules the roost at this point in phonology. And that, I believe, is good and bad, and I'll explain why. So, to really do justice to optimality theory and to understand what kind of issues surround it, you have to go back to the so-called revolution of Chomsky. And of course, he's been mentioned here before, a very important linguistics figure. In 1957, he released a book, or published a book, I should say, called Syntactic Structures, and it really got people thinking about language in and of itself. Okay, so Syntactic Structures was a book which said you can look at a sentence and look at the elements within that sentence without having to think about how the sentence was produced or how it's comprehended. You can look at it in terms of its structure alone. In other words, you don't have to have any psychology in your linguistics. Now, today, in modern linguistics, interestingly, a lot of psychology is being brought back into linguistics with things like psycholinguistics, language processing. Neurolinguistics, of course, has psychological aspects to it, and neuroscience. So it's interesting to see it sort of swinging back in that direction. However, that is the way that linguistics used to be. A lot of it was, in fact, almost all of it was looking at language as a psychological construct. If you think back to things like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which has been mentioned in the podcast before, that's the hypothesis that your worldview is shaped by the language that you speak. So obviously that is very much psychological in nature, right? I mean, that's talking about the sort of cognitive organization of the concepts in your head, right? And one can imagine that language processing, which is kind of a modern term that we use, certainly is concerned with psychology, but the generative tradition, that is to say, the tradition that started after Syntactic Structures was published, is not really concerned with so-called psychological reality. And this becomes clear if you look at things like transformational grammar. So, transformational grammar was a slightly newer version of the analysis that Chomsky proposed in Syntactic Structures, where he says that things like WH fronting, so the fronting of interrogative pronouns. So instead of saying you are going where, you say where are you going. You put that where all the way to the front. Now, in a transformational grammar account, one possible account of that is that there is a trace element that is left in the original syntactic position after the verb. So going where, with that original where location gets a trace, and the where is moved up to the front of the sentence. Now, when you hear that, it's kind of funny, because maybe you've seen a syntactic tree that shows these trace elements. Sometimes they'll show them as a little t, and you'll have this sort of curvy line that goes from that little t up to the word where at the beginning of the sentence. And it might seem kind of weird, because if you're thinking about it in terms of language production, you can't produce something that's already been passed over. So by the time you get to the verb, you have to have already said where. But that doesn't seem to be an issue for the generative tradition and transformational grammar in this case, because things are looked at in terms of wholes, right? So the entire sentence is looked at as one massive unit, which has some kind of internal structure, and all that they're trying to do is show relations between the constituents within it. So there is no kind of linear restriction for these types of theories. They're worried about just basic structure, right? The dependencies between items and so forth. So that is the type of thinking that has dominated the generative literature, or that did dominate the generative literature for a time. Now, the sort of Chomsky proposal of principles and parameters in what I guess would be the early 80s, I believe, maybe mid 80s. That was an attempt, at least the way I see it, to bring psychological reality back into the generative tradition. So you had this assumption that there were these universal parameters that could be set when a child was learning language. So this was mentioned, I should say, I believe, in the last episode on child language acquisition. That you just set these parameters with whatever language you want. So if you have if the child is learning a pro-drop language and they don't hear a lot of pronouns, then presumably they will flip the pro-drop parameter setting to on, and they will all of a sudden not need to specify pronouns in their production. In subject position, that is. I guess maybe that makes sense, but it's clearly an attempt to bring psychological reality back into the generative tradition. I'm not sure that it was that successful. In fact, principles and parameters is kind of not accepted anymore, at least not at face value. So that is the generative tradition in a nutshell. What I think you need to know about generative linguistics to get what I'm about to say about optimality theory. And let me mention also, the reason it's called generative linguistics is because that and rule-based theories really go hand in hand. So these rules you are making so that you can generate sentences. So a rule like S consists of NP followed by VP. A syntactic rule like that can be used to generate a sentence. And that becomes less clear when you get to things like transformational grammar and you're moving things around, and you have traces and pro-drop, you have big pro, little pro, all these weird null elements, so elements that don't show up on the surface. You have a distinction between surface structure and deep structure and all this stuff that comes along with it the later you go into the generative tradition. But the point is that it's called generative because you want some process by which you can make the structures that are seen in the world's languages. That's the idea. Okay? Where does optimality theory come into all of this? Well, optimality theory came about primarily in the 90s. And like I said, it has taken over literature in phonology for the most part. From the traditional rule-based account. Now, rule-based phonology is where that field was in, let's say, the 70s to the late 70s. In the early 80s, people started looking for something else. Okay. Now, it's kind of funny because we're still looking at rule-based syntax. Right? I mean, that the generative tradition is still very much alive and well in syntax, in that subdiscipline. And for some reason in phonology it's not so much, and I think it's because optimality theory, you say whatever you want about it as a theory, but I think it's made people ask the correct questions. So anyway, let me try not to get off track here. So optimality theory comes about in this time when psychological reality is not important. Right, so you're looking for things that can explain the phenomena that you see. You're not looking for things that can explain how these things occur in the brain, or how they occur with the mind, or how they're processed. The sort of production comprehension dichotomy. Okay, so this is something in Ling 1. You hear about this, production and comprehension. That's what makes up these two ends of linguistics. You can either produce something from scratch, or you can hear something and parse it and figure out what's being said. That's not important so much, right? What is important is that you explain the structure that you see. And with phonology, it was always about sort of deep structure versus surface structure, right? So we know that with phonological rules, for example, traditional 70s phonological rules, you had underlying representations, which are then made into surface structures, right? And depending on how so things like rule ordering would come into play. So if you ordered rules one way, you got one output. If you ordered them another way, you got another output. And whatever output you got that was correct, well, that was your correct ordering, right? And that made a lot of sense to a lot of people, but there came a time when people kind of got fed up with that and said, well, there has to be a better way to do this, because the problem with the rule-based theory, if we're saying, as the generative tradition wants to say, that there is this so-called universal grammar, so these shared properties between languages, and every language has its own set of phonological rules and its own order for these rules, and so on and so forth, that's problematic, right? There has to be something else. And thus came Optimality Theory. Smolensky and Prince, if I remember correctly, were the two to first publish Optimality Theory in something resembling its current form. I believe it was called something different at that time, but what that name was, I actually don't know. But Optimality Theory, let me remind you, if you don't remember from the previous phonology episode so long ago, it has to do with constraints and constraint ranking. So the idea is that you have a set of constraints which try to stop something from happening. So a possible constraint can be don't have a coda in your syllable. So no coda, so that would mean anything after the vowel. You don't want anything after the vowel in a syllable. That's a possible constraint. Another possible constraint might be, because remember we're dealing with underlying representations going up into surface forms, it might be don't change anything in the underlying representation. So in other words, have the exact same thing come out in the surface form. That would be what we would call a faithfulness constraint. So you want to remain faithful to the underlying representation. Another one might be, let's see. So different forms of faithfulness constraints with varying degrees of precision. So you might have something like don't epenthesize. That is to say, don't insert any segments into the surface form that aren't in the underlying form. And likewise, you might have don't delete anything, right? So you want, those are essentially saying the same thing, stay faithful to the underlying form. And other things like the no coda constraint that I mentioned just a moment ago would not be faithfulness constraints, but they'd be called markedness constraints. So that would be like no coda, for example, a syllable with a coda, that is to say anything after the vowel, anything after the syllable nucleus, if you want to really get specific, is more marked cross-linguistically than the so-called open syllable, so a CV syllable. So you would prefer a CV syllable to a CVC syllable. So therefore you have a constraint like no coda, and you try and keep some kind of markedness hierarchy going if that language requires it. So some languages don't care if you have a coda consonant or not, right? And you can have all kinds of crazy constraints, align constraints, constraints having to do with, you could have any constraint you want. So you could say, don't have any, don't have any interdental fricatives. So in English we have two interdental fricatives, we have th and the. You could have a constraint that says don't have any interdental fricatives at all. And it would kind of make sense because they're cross-linguistically rare, right? And you can see where I'm getting at with this. The point is that your constraints, whatever set of constraints you come up with, are true across the board. So in other words, every language shares the same set of constraints. Now, this set of constraints would have to be enormously large, and indeed that's the idea. But the basic difference between this and rule-based phonology is that every language shares the same set. The only thing that changes is how they're ranked. Okay, so presumably a language which does not have interdental fricatives would rank a constraint saying don't have interdental fricatives higher. In other words, it's more important not to have interdental fricatives than something else, whereas English obviously ranks it lower than some other constraint which wants interdental fricatives, or maybe they're in the underlying representation, or whatever. Okay. So that was the big draw for optimality theory, is you can have this master set of constraints shared by all languages, and all you have to change from one language to another is the ranking of those constraints. It's very much better than rule-based phonology in that sense, because in rule-based phonology you're not sharing anything, right? You're changing rules willy-nilly as you need. There's nothing inherently shared between languages in that paradigm. Now, clearly, you can share basic concepts, right? So, Esperantization, for example, which is a change from a stop to a fricative, you could have different rules in different languages that both really are just talking about Esperantization. So you're changing a stop to a fricative in both cases. But with optimality theory, you can have them share the same constraints and do things like Esperantization based on how you change the rankings. Okay, so that's the idea. So you're sharing things, sharing more at least than we used to. And so for generative linguistics and linguists who subscribe to it, it was very appealing. And I think to this day it still is very appealing for those reasons. But optimality theory has some, in my opinion, gaping holes. Not holes, but some very large issues that make it difficult to make psychologically real, and therefore difficult to place into any kind of framework having to do with language processing or cognitive linguistics, anything like that. These issues are things that you don't really see until you try and look at it through that lens. Okay, so it's the very fact that it is so popular nowadays has to do with this kind of generative tradition, this not caring about the psychological reality of language, just looking at it on paper, has led to a very widely accepted theory, which, in my opinion, really leads to more questions than it answers. So the one primary issue with optimality theory is called the richness of the base. So you have to have some number of inputs that come out onto the surface, and in traditional rule-based phonology, those inputs were your underlying forms. Now I've mentioned underlying forms just a minute ago in terms of optimality theory, but in fact you don't really use underlying forms in the same way in optimality theory. So the assumption is that in order for your constraint rankings to be robust enough, detailed enough, because you have so many constraints and you have so many different languages, in order to keep that whole thing, that whole shared set of constraints working properly and properly ranked, you have to have an infinite number of possible inputs. So there's some kind of mechanism called gen. It's spelled G-E-N in all uppercase letters traditionally. And gen is an infinite number of possible inputs for any given output form. So let's take the word, lake in English. That word lake is optimal. It is the optimal candidate because an infinite number of other possible candidates were less optimal given whatever ranking governs English phonology. When you hear it in those terms, and I've already mentioned language processing here, so many of you will probably be thinking in that sort of frame, it sounds funky at best, right? First of all, anything infinite when you're talking about psychological reality is problematic. there are different sort of levels of infinite, if you will. So we know, for example, that in syntax we have a finite number of rules that can allow for the production of an infinite number of sentences. That's quite a different thing than we're saying with optimality theory. Why? Because in order to come up with lake, you have to have processed an infinite number of inputs. Now, as it turns out, there's some algorithmic shortcuts you can do, and it's been done in some of the literature showing that, in fact, you don't need an infinite number of inputs in optimality theory for it to work. The problem is that it's a basic premise of the theory. So at best, it needs to be adapted so as to no longer include an infinite number of inputs. And then the question becomes, well, how many inputs do you need then to allow for every language to come out with their own optimal candidate given what inputs? So if they're no longer infinite, then what are they? What governs gen on a language by language basis? And already you've lost a little bit of that universality aspect of optimality theory if you begin asking that question. And I think that's why that question really has not been asked in any meaningful way that I know of in the literature. So that's the primary qualm I have with optimality theory, is the richness of the base. Right now, another issue that I have is the fact that optimality theory, without infinite inputs, doesn't predict much. In other words, you can look at all the OT papers you want, and I would suggest, if any of you have access to peer-reviewed journals, please do find any of them that you can and check this. Find an OT paper that does not know the correct output form and is plugging in some number of input forms and then produces the correct output form. So let me reiterate what I'm saying here. Try and find any work done in optimality theory that takes some number of input forms, produces some output form, without knowing the output form in advance. Now, that might seem trivial, but in fact it's not, because what I'm suggesting is that optimality theory has no predictive power. That is to say that you have to know what the correct output form is in order to be able to say, oh, well, look, with this ranking of constraints and these inputs, that correct output form is the optimal output form. You're really just describing in greater detail what you already know. The issue being that the details that you are improving upon, you've also made up. The whole notion of constraint, the whole notion of what inputs you end up choosing, because clearly no peer-reviewed paper could physically have an infinite set of input candidates through which to go and find the optimal form. So there is some set that's been chosen for some reason, and some set of constraints, some subset of constraints that are chosen and ranked to show why a given output form is the correct output form, but there's no prediction going on, right? So you're starting with a completed form and working backwards and then saying, well, here's how it went. It's essentially for phonology what generative syntax is for syntax. You're starting with the sentence as a whole, and you're saying, well, look, this interrogative pronoun could be moving to the front, and we could leave a trace in this position, and yeah, it's a null element, it doesn't actually exist in the surface form, but it must be in the underlying form because that's the only way it works with our theory. To me, that's a problem, and that's a big problem, because we know that the nature of language is that it exists in the human mind. We know that in order for it to be used, it has to be used in a linear fashion. And the question then becomes, well, two questions really. One, how can I process an infinite set of possible input forms that apparently come from this gen device that I have to then find the optimal candidate for? And two, I have no predictive power without that infinite set. So I have to have already picked out some kind of subset of possible input candidates, and thus some kind of subset of constraints ranked in a language-specific fashion in order to have any predictive power at all. But in order to figure out those subsets, I already have to know the output form. I don't know of any other way of doing it other than knowing the output form. If somebody does, I would really be honored if you would send me an email and explain it to me, because that's one thing I really don't understand about optimality theory. So those are my two issues that I take with optimality theory, and why I think that as a linguistic theory, its greatest worth is forcing these questions to be asked that have to do with language processing. As you know, my primary interest is processing, psycholinguistics, things like this, where the fact that things are taken in linear fashion can't be taken for granted. In fact, it needs to be used and worked into any theory that you subscribe to. Because that's how language is presented, whether you're producing it or comprehending it, right? I mean, it's just a fact of the physics around language, if you will. But optimality theory is another one of these theories that doesn't take that into account. Looks at it as a sort of autonomous beast, right? So something that just sits out there that you have on paper that you just want to try and explain the best way that you can. But I think an explanation like this is not necessarily the explanation that we need. Rather, we need something that can fit into these processing issues and these psycholinguistic issues, because there's been altogether too much work, in my opinion, dealing with language from a generative standpoint, from the standpoint of the generative tradition. I think it's just been overdone, in my opinion, and so that's why I wanted to go back to optimality theory. I know it really dominates the literature out there, and I just can't get behind it from an academic standpoint. I just can't. I don't want to throw any weight behind it, because I mean, obviously, I want to make sure that you guys know what it is, and I want to make sure that it's clear that it's a dominant theory in phonology. But I think that it's important to point out these issues and point out the questions that you're forced to ask that OT doesn't answer, and doesn't answer seemingly by design. And then I want to put forward one more question and say, when will the masses of manpower that are focused on issues of optimality theory give a little and maybe use some of that manpower for considering other issues that might shed light in other areas that badly need it, like issues of language learning and things like that. So anyway, there's my rant on optimality theory. It's got interesting aspects. It's certainly well represented in the literature. I think it is not without issue, and I hope that I've made those issues clear. And I would love to hear your opinions on optimality theory and the generative tradition in general. Let me also mention before I close that I've made a point of mentioning in past episodes that I don't consider myself a generative linguist, so you should take that into consideration when you hear any opinions that I give on this show. Being interested in the areas that I'm interested in, I really don't have the luxury, I think, of being a generative linguist per se, just because it doesn't concern itself with the kind of issues that I'm interested in. However, I'd love to hear any of your opinions. I know many of you are quite well versed in linguistics, more than you know. So I'd love to hear your opinions not only on OT, but anything having to do with the generative tradition. What do you think about theories that don't take psychological reality into account? Theories that by not taking that into account then become essentially useless for things like language processing or psycholinguistics. Certainly they're useful in other areas. I don't want to downgrade their importance in any way. I'm not saying that I don't think optimality theory is not an important theory. I do think rather that it is an important development in modern linguistics, and I think it's a worthy theory and worthy of discussion. I'm not sure if it's worthy of having taken over the entire subfield of phonology as it seems to have done. But anyway, like I said at the beginning of this episode, if it forces us to ask the right questions, then it is, in fact, a good theory. And I think, at the very least, it's allowing this discourse to go on. So, this discourse into the generative tradition versus more psychological linguistic issues. So, that's all I have for you guys today. I'd like to thank you, as always, for listening. And as always, I'm on Twitter at LinguistChris, and I do really encourage you to tweet me. I try and tweet back as often as I can. If you have a more involved question or comment, you can email me at linguistchris@gmail.com. Thanks again.